Hello everybody, and in this video I'm going to be showing the final game that I have played in the 4NCL this weekend. The Four Nations Chess League is a very fun thing to do, and if any of you are listening to this and are in Great Britain and play for a team, then I would suggest you give it a shot because it's quite a lot of fun. In this game, I was white and playing against Steve Tarr, who is about 160 ECF and about 1750 FIDE. Time control is 100 minutes in 40 moves, with 50 minutes added on to complete the game, and a 30-second increment starting from move 1 and lasting the whole way through. So we started the game at 11 in the morning, and I really wanted to get home. So I was playing quite quickly and not really thinking very much. So the game began with my usual c4, nice f6, g3, e6, and now knight f3. So after d5, my usual move is to play b3 here. But instead, I changed my move because I've recently been reading some opening theory. Bishop g2, and then if black takes, I can win the pawn back quite easily, and then things are looking fairly good for white. But instead, bishop e7 was played, and now I castled. Now here, if black takes the pawn, I can actually play knight a3. So if takes knight a3, and if black takes my knight on a3, he's wasted a move because he will have made two bishop moves. And again, the c4 pawn is eventually going to be lost. And I'll also have the b file for my rook to aim at his b pawn. I'll have quite a lot of compensation for the weak pawn structure. So the book move is c5, whoops, pawn c5, knight takes, castles, and we get an interesting game. Maybe I could play d3 here, or even b3, bishop b2. So I wasn't afraid of this particular position. Instead, though, he castled, and now I protect the pawn with b3. And the one thing I don't like about this system is that black can, if he wants to, play d4 and gain some space with the pawns. Again, I'm not really too afraid of it. It's not like I don't know what to do, but I just feel a little uncomfortable. It doesn't really suit my style. Generally, you're meant to undermine the pawn with playing e3 and bishop b2 and going after it. Eventually, if white swaps off a few pieces, black's pawn structure can be a little bit loose. But instead, he played b6, leading to a more quiet system. Bishop b2, bishop b7. And now I want to prevent black playing d4, and mission accomplished. He can't play d4 yet. But I don't want to play d4 myself yet. I want to develop my pieces. But if I play knight c3, then d4 is possible. So I play e3 with the idea of knight c3, queen e2, and then putting my rooks on c1 and d1, and having a fairly nice position. He played knight e4, and this is one of the reasons I did not play d4 last move. I can play d3 and kick the knight. And he played the move which is made available by the maneuver knight to e4. He played bishop f6. So he has managed to fianchetto his dark squared bishop in a way, putting it on the long diagonal. And here, if I take the knight, he can take my bishop and my rook will be trapped. So I play knight to e5. Now here, If he takes my knight, then great, I'll take his bishop back. And my bishop on the long diagonal being unopposed could put a lot of pressure on black's position on the king side. Also, having the two bishops may be good for me in an endgame scenario when the position opens up a bit more and pieces are exchanged. So he first played knight d7 to go after my knight, and I didn't want to exchange knights at this point, so I played f4. I think pawn takes knight, he can play knight takes knight, and things are very awkward for me. So I just protect my knight, and also if he does take it, I'll play f takes, and that will allow my rook on f1 to spring to life. He retreats his piece on e4, and he has two main moves. One is knight e to c5. My plan here was to play b4, knight a6, b5, knight c back to c5, d4, so I'm kicking it around and gaining lots of space with the pawns, knight to e4, and here I thought knight c6 looked very nice for me. If the queen moves, then I could play a move like knight d2 and gain some space, or even bishop takes knight, and I've got lots and lots of space. So bishop takes, pawn takes, and black has to play knight b8, and then perhaps queen c2, and knight takes c6 is impossible here because of c takes d5, which would attack both knights with my queen. So rook e8, knight c3, takes, and then I think queen d6 and rook ac1 give me a slightly better position here, especially as black is still not really developed and hasn't managed to move the knight out yet. So I was prepared to play all these moves, and it looked fairly nice for me, quite comfortable. Instead, though, knight d6 was played. At this point, I want to clarify what's happening in the centre. I felt uneasy with him being able to play d takes c4 and then exchange off light squared bishops. Usually white needs that light squared bishop as protection and also a annoying piece to put a lot of pressure on black. So I take on d5, and here I was expecting the move e takes d5. There we go, now we've closed off the long diagonal temporarily. Then perhaps knight c3, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. Then here I felt that after d4 and bishop f6, I'm fairly safe in being able to capture on d5. And at this point, we're equal on pawns, but I've got two central pawns, which will be a good middle game advantage. As we transition to the end game, it may be less useful because in a king and pawn endgame, usually the pawns on the wing, on the rook files, are strongest because your king has to go all the way to the edge of the board to stop them from promoting. So here, though, this looks quite pleasant for me, and I am threatening knight takes bishop check, pawn takes knight, and then bishop on g2 taking on b6, leaving black with horrible pieces. So that was one potential line, but instead my opponent played knight to f5, going for the fork on e3. So queen e2 seemed fairly natural. I'm defending my b2 bishop, so my knight on e5 is no longer truly pinned, and also protecting the pawn, so the queen's doing two things at once. Knight takes e5 was played in the game, but I'd anticipated e takes d5, knight c3, knight c5, and then d4. And if black tries to occupy the square, I will capture. Now here, my pawn on d4 is quite nice, guarding my knight and stopping black playing c5, because that would open up my fianchettoed bishop on b2. And also the e4 pawn for black is slightly under pressure. Perhaps queen c2 could be played here. So black did not do that. He played knight takes e5. I took with the pawn. I want to keep pieces on. Now bishop g5. So I've actually got I think what's called a box formation, where I've got 4 pawns which are both doubled and next to each other. So 2 pawns on the d file and 2 on the e file. And I can literally make a 4x4 square if I had the pawns on the 3rd rank on the 4th rank, if I pushed e4 and d4. And it's quite hard to break down this box formation. You generally have to attack the pawns from behind. So here I considered this move for a very, very long time. Eventually I chickened out, but afterwards we analysed rook takes f5, pawn takes, and then knight c3. So I've got all my pieces developed, and I've sacrificed the exchange for a pawn as well. So the material is almost even, and my 2 centre pawns on the 5th rank are making black's pieces very restricted. So rook e8, d4, rook c8, rook f1, and here I think I'm actually better. Perhaps g6 might have to be played. And the trouble is, if black ever tries to undermine my pawns, I'll push them. So if he played c6 or c5, I can push d6, and if f6 was played, I could push e6 and have a protected passed pawn. Also, as the position is somewhat static and closed up, with there being no open files for the black rooks, my knight is probably as good, if not better, than the black rook, and as I'm a pawn up, this would give me an advantage. So this was definitely an option, and I feel a little bit, I feel quite bad that I didn't play this, because it would have made it much more interesting. Instead, I played rook to f3, guarding the e3 pawn, and I looked at bishop takes e3 check, rook takes, knight takes, queen takes, bishop takes. Here I felt that I could exchange bishops and develop with tempo. Then the queen would move back, and after rook d1, rook a d8, d4, again, I feel like my knight is quite good. Maybe not quite as good as the rook here, but I've also got a bishop. So my 2 minor pieces should overpower black's rook, especially as it can't be very... the extra rook can't really be made to be very active. So in this position, I don't want to open up lots of open files. I'd like to just keep it as it is and maneuver with my knight and bishop. Anyway, we'd have a game here. We'd have an interesting middle game and end game. Instead, though, he played queen takes d5. And there are lots of threats now connected with bishop takes e3 and knight takes e3. And his long diagonal is putting a lot of pressure on my position. But I do have a very nice move here. I have rook f2. So I'm guarding my bishop with the rook, so the queen can't take the bishop on g2 and exchange things off. And his queen's under attack. And he's being skewered, because when he moves the queen aside, I will take the bishop on b7. In the end, he had to play queen a5. I immediately took. And here, rook a b8 was played. Now, I think the computer says the best move is either rook takes f5 or moving the bishop back to maybe e4. But I thought I had a way of trapping the queen that looked really elegant. I played d4, taking away the b5 and c5 squares for the queen. Rook takes b7, and now bishop c3. So I felt like I'd won the queen here, and it was game over. But there was an optical illusion. Because my bishop had just been on b7 before it was captured, I thought his queen could not come to d5, but unfortunately it can here. Queen d5, e4, knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes check, rook takes, and pawn takes. So here black has 2 pawns for the piece, and that d pawn is advanced. You know, it can come to d4 after black plays c5. So my knight may not be that much better than black's 2 pawns. I'll have to keep the pieces on and see if I can win a pawn before we go into an endgame with very few pieces. So here, I thought he had chances, but but instead he actually sacrificed the piece with knight takes d4. So in this line, he's not getting as much material for the earlier line. I take with the pawn to undouble the pawns, queen d5, and now play knight d2, finally developing my v1 knight. So it's now only 1 pawn for the piece that black has. And I want to swap off my knight for his bishop because it's much easier to play an endgame with a bishop, for me at least. So after c5, I decide that capturing is in order because my d4 pawn is backwards and he's blockading it. So my d4 pawn is actually quite weak. I take, and here black can take it with 2 things. If b takes, I thought I saw a really nice move here. Knight e4, bishop e7, and the computer confirms it. Knight f6 check. Now, if he takes the piece, I have queen g4 check, king g8, e takes f6, and I'm threatening both pawn takes bishop check, attacking the rook on f8, and queen g7 mate. And he can't parry both threats. He'd play rook g8, check, e5, and now I could sacrifice my queen and promote it to a new queen. And I thought, I'd evaluated this far, and I thought this must be easily winning, and there's probably a checkmate here, because I'm a rook and bishop up. I didn't know there is a checkmate here. There's a forced mate with bishop takes pawn, check, king h6, queen check, king h5, g4 check, king takes, queen g7 check, king h4, queen h6 check, and then I have the very nice finish with king g4, h3 mate. So using all my pieces there, apart from the rook on a1, which is just window dressing. So that was a line that I really wanted to play because I felt it would cap off a really good end to my 4NCL season. This would be my 5th game, and if I did this, I'd win all 5 games. But he didn't take with the pawn, he took with the queen. Then I played knight e4, and now queen c6. So if I take the bishop, he has queen takes c3. So I wanted to create more threats and also parry his attack. I played I played queen f3. So now if we give black a fairly useless move like a6, can you see what I'd play here? Yeah, I would play knight f6 check. And after he captures, I can take the queen for nothing. And I'll be a queen up. So black would resign here. In the game, I'd analysed both these moves, but I felt that the one he played was less pretty. The move I'd looked at was rook c8, guarding his queen, and then I thought I could play knight takes g5, queen takes c3, queen takes b7, queen takes a1 check, and then king g2. Now I'm threatening queen takes f7 check and queen takes c8 checkmate. So after rook f8 to guard against both moves, I could play rook takes f7, and after he throws in a check, and I put my king on h3 where there are no more checks, it's mate in a few moves. For example, queen takes e5 would stop rook takes g7 mating, but I have rook takes rook check, king takes, and then a kiss of death checkmate with queen f7 mate. So that's the more pretty mating pattern. Instead, he played rook c7, and I played bishop b4. So I've got my bishop off the line of his queen and rook battery, and I'm attacking the rook on f8, and I'm attacking the knight on g5. So a move I really wanted him to play was bishop e7 to guard against both threats, but now I have bishop takes bishop, rook takes, and knight f6 check again. Pawn takes and queen takes queen. So he couldn't play bishop e7. Instead, he played queen b5. I took the rook, why not? King takes, and then I grabbed the bishop. So it may look embarrassing at this stage, but he does have an interesting move. Queen takes e5. So here, he will go 2 rooks for a pawn, which is equivalent to being a piece down. So you might be able to play on a bit and go for tricks. But I did not want that to happen. I wanted to finish the game because it's a very long journey home and I don't want to have to play for hours on end. So at this point, I'd only used up about 40 minutes of my time. He'd used up about 70. So I found a move which wins almost on the spot. And that move is rook d1. There's another move that's slightly more accurate, but you'll see what it is in a moment. After queen takes knight, I have a mate in 3 here. Can you find it? Yeah, queen a8. That was the move that was more accurate than rook d1, playing check immediately, and I think it's a mate in about 9 or 10 moves. And here he resigned. So we'd not yet reached the time control, which I liked. I didn't want to have to play another few hours. So this was move 29, was my move queen a8, and I would have probably mated him on move 30. Because after king e7, queen d8 checkmate, he could have stalled by playing rook c8, and then I could take the rook and again threaten checkmate. So this game was very interesting and marks the end of my 4NCL season. So hopefully I'll do just as well next year as well. 100% for the season is pretty good. I think here, what was very interesting in this game, just to quickly go through some of the key points, was after c4, knight f6, g3, e6, knight, pawn, bishop, bishop, castle, castle. We've both set up our structures. Black's going to try and be solid, and as it turns out, play b6, bishop, b7, and then slowly try and make his minor pieces worthwhile. Whereas my technique is to do a double fianchetto, which I think is slightly superior to him having a single fianchetto. I think you can see what my bias is. I like fianchettoing. But the point is that his bishop on e7 is not really aiming at anything. It's got an empty diagonal on its longer diagonal, and it can only move to 4 different squares, whereas my bishop can move to 5 squares and also take the knight, making a 6th square. So it's more mobile. And then here, I think the key point is development, really, because I always was taught develop your minor pieces first, and then you can start developing the heavy pieces, the queen and rooks. I don't really count castling as a development of the heavy pieces. That's more of a development of the king in my mind. So I think what this proves is that development is not necessarily along those lines. Sometimes you can develop a rook before a bishop, for example, if it suits you. I think what's key is finding the necessary moves, which is a theme I've talked about before. So here, after knight f5, what is necessary is defending the e4 pawn, the e3 pawn, or at least the e3 square. So I have to develop a heavy piece. Or I could play king f2, but let's not get into that that rather bad move there. So queen e2. So I'm not developing my minor piece, which is the knight. I'm developing the heavier piece. Then after he exchanges, bishop g5. And a lot of people would say, including some master players, that I am behind in development because I have only developed my 2 bishops and I've castled, as well as moving the queen. And black has developed all his minor pieces and is creating threats. But I would not agree because I've developed the queen, so that's an equal number of developing moves. And I now developed the rook. Also, rook takes f5 was an interesting move. And so now I have 4 pieces developed. It doesn't matter so much about the order in which they're developed in some middle games. Obviously, at the beginning, don't play your rooks out first with h4 and rook h3. But what's interesting to me is that my knight on b1 doesn't need to be in the action yet. It can't really control any dark squares with its next move because it will be landing on a dark square. So here, I could have played knight d2, for example, or knight c3, but that isn't the best move. Again, what's best is strategy. It's based on principle, but also tactics are incredibly important. My king's already castled, and as I say, I've got an equal number of pieces developed, so I shouldn't really be worse or be subject to some winning tactic. Whereas black has brought the queen out into the middle, which is generally inadvisable, and also has a couple of problems with the coordination of the pieces. So after rook f2, I'm doing the skewer. And obviously taking a piece is more important than developing if there are no consequences for my actions. Rook a b8, and look at black's rooks. They still haven't really developed. They're not active. So admittedly, I do screw this up a little bit. I should probably play bishop back to e4, but still, my attack on the queen, the badly placed queen, is the more important thing. It's not that my knight is not yet brought into the game. And now it is. Now I have brought it in. So after this, being the piece up was, for me at least, it was fairly easy to win this game being a piece up because black has no real initiative because of the terrible coordination of the pieces. And my rook on a1 has not been doing anything the whole game, and my last piece brought into the action, just that's the last straw. And then a mate a couple of moves later. So anyway, comment, like, subscribe, and I hope you got something from this video. See you next time. Bye.